I was intrigued by the title of the film, Mugabe and Me. It suggests that you developed a special relationship with him. And I think I could see that the way he hugged you, and the way he smiled when he heard you were from Ghana. Could you tell us what motivated you to make the film and about the relationship that you had with Mugabe that made the film possible?
Thank you very much, Patricia. It was a nuanced relationship. It wasn't like a typical friendship. Mugabe, I'm told, doesn't have many friends and doesn't understand the concept of friends, but he kind of brought me into his inner circle by allowing me to film at close quarters. That was him saying, I trust this guy. He's a Ghanaian. We trust Ghanaians. His first wife, Sally, was a Ghanaian. He saw that I was dedicated, living in the country for 3 years, going to all corners of Zimbabwe. And to him, he felt that was a way of showing that dedication. And so he and George Charamba and his team thought, let's give this Ghanaian guy a chance. And so, yeah, the relationship was good. Off camera, we talk about Ghana, we talk about oil
Hmm.
discovery in Ghana, we talk about how much he loved peppery food, which many Zimbabweans don't.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I mean, he inspired me to buy land in Ghana, in a region where his wife was from. What inspired me to make this film? Again, it's just knowing that there was just something that I wasn't hearing. What was it? This guy went from the knighthood and people loving him to all of a sudden he was a dictator, and I just wanted to know and delve a bit deeper into that.
Mm, Right. Well, Andy, were there any specific challenges that you encountered when, with producing this film?
I think making any film that has any polarizing figure is always going to be a challenge because you're especially with, at the moment we're talking to several stakeholders and that everybody's going to come with their own opinion. And I think what I saw in the film and what I knew through Roy had all this had amassed all this archive and had almost, I mean, there's a load of things that can be bred from this, but the challenge is, how do you make an unconventional film about a person that everybody that you've heard to be deemed a certain way? I think one of the catalysts for the initial story was a film about 18 years ago now called Mugabe and the White
White farmer.
Mugabe and the White Farmer. And I remember that film because it was up for an Oscar at the time, for an Academy Award. And I had lived, my brother's in the audience now, and we'd lived in Zimbabwe. And at that time we were in Zimbabwe, it was like some of the greatest years of our life. It was a real sort of, it was a wonderful place to be. And so I had a lived experience in Zimbabwe. And I think that the challenges really were about saying, there's clearly nuances. There's clearly a lot of dimension to the story of how you talk about a particular individual. I mean, we've seen that time and time again over the decades with typically leaders from the global south, who are deemed a certain way, when in actual fact, the ones that are making our lives hell aren't from that part of the world. And I think that the challenges of producing something like this is actually you're trying to take on a system, not only a political system, but also a broadcasting system. That's where we operate. We operate in in the vessels of mainstream media. We're constantly trying to get ideas away which are refuted, challenged, and if they don't come from a certain perspective, you're immediately not welcomed into the door. So our challenge is really at trying to find money to make things like this hit the screen because, as a producer, what I saw in this is that here's somebody just with archive we've never seen before. And the audiences and people should have the ability to see that.
So, do you think, as Black people, as Africans, we should correct, and why? And for whose audience? The audience in the West, or for Africans on the continent?
I don't think it's a case of correcting. I
Mhm.
think it's a case of delving deeper into the history, delving deeper on what we've been told here in the West, and looking, going, taking the risk, you know, spending that time, those years on the ground, and actually finding out what the nuances are to this story. Because living here, many people didn't know about land reform and the involvement of the Labour government, the relationship. He had a great relationship with Margaret Thatcher. He had a great relationship with the Queen. Every rally that I attended, he would always mention the Queen. He would say, you know, she visited us here, her children visited us, we have no problem with the Queen. I think he was quoted saying, "It's those demons in number 10 Downing Street that I have a problem with." And so, you know, again, he's a guy that really he's a very British guy, as you can see. Very, very, very British, Mugabe. But no, for us, he was not necessarily correcting, but just wanting to find out a lot. When we knew there was more to it.
Yeah. Would you say that you humanized him for us in the film? I mean, you made him seem like much more like a real person than a stereotype. Um, and you know, is that what you set out to do, or was
I
that
think that's the
came
nature.
about through the production
I suppose that's
editing process?
I suppose there's a dual nature there of the archive sort of telling its story, and then obviously we have to try and work out what story we're telling. And I have pushed Roy to sort of say, and that partly goes back to your initial question about the title, is that what was your experience in all of this? What were you seeing? What were you feeling? And you know, that's partly the inclusion of this sort of, you know, what's your personal reflection? What did you take from this? And I thought with the amount of material he had, you could make the Mugabe years, you know, and do something that really sort of talks about that very vast and complex history. But you know, I think we are all humans at the end of the day. So, you know, like I think there's no way you can paint one, but we weren't going in there to say, well, here's the picture that you've always had. You can go and watch you know, the numerous other films that talk about Mugabe for that portrayal. And I just thought, you know, I suppose, and again, to your previous question about is it for Africans or a Western audience, I think it's for all audiences who just want to be, you know, we're in a time now where truth is hard to find. Truth is very complex. And you know, when there are many versions, people have to rise at that truth for themselves. And I think that that's what we have to do as content creators, as producers, as filmmakers, is we're constantly saying, well, actually, there's another side of the story, and that traditionally Africans have not been allowed to tell, you know, or traditionally people who come from our backgrounds are locked out. And so you have to question, if it is being told from the other side, what's the voice that's actually negating that other side as well? And the balance is sometimes hard to find, but the me in this story is what we try to focus on.
I mean, sometimes the camera seems to be an intrusion, you know, showing up, and you sort of pointed out his vulnerabilities at the time. What access restrictions did you face, and you know, did the editing of the film after his death probably give you the liberty you needed to show his vulnerabilities? Basically, would you have shown them if he was still alive and you were still interacting with him?
Yeah, no, I did. He was open. He was up for debate at all times, and you know, even the first film, we showed some of his vulnerabilities. The restrictions were cabinet day. So when there was a government of national unity, I was allowed to go into cabinet and spend the first 10 minutes filming people arriving. I'd obviously try and take liberties and see if I can hide in the corner and continue filming whilst they're chatting. And that's when how our relationship kind of, you know, a relationship of kind of reaction and interaction with Mugabe, because he would then look at me and say, "What, you want to stay longer now?" You know, and so there was restrictions into cabinet, there was restrictions in the Politburo, the high decision body in ZANU-PF. But outside of that, you know, I thought I've got pretty good access. You know, like Andy said, we've got 300 hours worth of material, and this is just a snapshot. You know, others have to, you know, we want to do something like the Mugabe years. And there will be people that say, well, why didn't you talk about this? Why didn't you talk about that? And, you know, we hope we can, you know, develop this and do a 6-part series, which really delves deeper into Mugabe and Zimbabwe years. But for now, it's the me bit, you know, that we...
Yeah. Okay, I mean, you know, in some sense, when we try to, you know, write counter narratives of people who have been stereotyped in the West, I think sometimes are we not sometimes in danger of sort of excusing some of the brutal aspects of their regimes? You know, if you think about Mugabe, and you mentioned some of the things that happened, but there were others that were left out. And your history started with him being head of ZANU-PF. That we know there's a lot of controversy around, the death of Geppetto and of Tondara, and lots of conflict within ZANU-PF before Mugabe emerged. So he was actually somebody. It could have been somebody who, despite all the issues, tolerated, and encouraged violence against his opposition. And yet here in the film, it doesn't really come out. And I think, are we excusing then the brutality of African leaders if we don't, link
No,
directly to some of these?
yeah, sure. No, I think that's a great question. When you look at post-colonial Zimbabwe, and if you look at the worst atrocities that was committed, it was Gukurahundi.
Mhm.
Now, we know that there are political squabbles between the parties and unacceptable violence that went ahead. So in a 54-minute film, you have to focus on an area in which you feel is of relevance and the worst of Mugabe. And the worst of Mugabe was his handing of Gukurahundi,
Mm.
where up to 20,000
Mm.
people had died. Now, when you look at the Western media, that was obviously kind of under the carpet. There wasn't much about that. They turned a blind eye to it. But we shone a light on that, whereas the West kind of swept it under the carpet.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, I'm going to follow this line a bit, actually, particularly around sanctions, because sanctions is shown in the film as the main cause of Zimbabwe's economic collapse. And I think, the film is correct, but, other countries have experienced sanctions, but they haven't looted, the coffers in the way that, Mugabe's cabinet did. They didn't. The land reform didn't result in his, senior leadership acquiring and land. And also in some countries you didn't have those 2.5 million refugees fled the country. So I mean, would you say that, that continuing to blame everything on sanctions to some degree is really is not the narrative that we should necessarily be adopting? And
Yeah.
although it's still central to yours, I mean, what?
No, sure. I with regard to the sanctions, and when you delve deeper into the American law that was out in 2001 when Bush put the sanction on, Zimbabwe were not able to get loans or credit lines from any of the multilateral agencies, the IMF, the World Bank, African Development Bank, because the American directors had a veto on that. So therefore, countries rely on borrowing in their credit ratings. And so so it was really, really difficult for them. So sanctions did play a part. How they handle sanctions, obviously new to them. I said in the film, there's a great deal of mismanagement, especially in the handling of the diamonds. I thought the diamond question was really, really key, because here we have an area, Chiadza, where it was the largest diamond field in over 100 years. And I remember when I was in Zimbabwe back in 2008, every weekend you'll have teachers, nurses, and doctors rushing to this diamond field because the diamonds are on the ground, these industrial diamonds, and looting themselves. And so what then happened was, after about 2 or 3 or 4 months, the army then came in, closed off the place, and then, yeah, I mean, you said looting took place. Yes, I guess so. But also being under sanctions and not being able to sell your minerals through the correct bodies because those institutions are under sanctions, you have to do it certain ways. And so there are so many unscrupulous people that came into Zimbabwe to try and exploit the situation, because if they can't sell some of their stuff on the market, you'd have to do it over the border. So again, I don't put all of the blame on the sanctions. I think yes, they utilize that as part of their propaganda, but it did play a part, a major part.
And I think we have to look at, the complex history of colonialism and post-colonial movement away from whoever the colonizers were in whichever country. I think that there is a deeper and more complicated story to tell. In that transition of power, of course there is going to be a lot of fallout. Of course there's going to be a lot of disarray, because effectively countries are trying to find themselves in this new world, which is still relatively young, and which we now know, is kind of a real sort of collusion by many, many forces outside of their own country. And that is not to skirt over or glamorize or even humanize to the point that you make the kind of the complexities of Mugabe or any other leader of any African country. I think that there are so many other nuances in which we should also discuss, which you in a film like this, I think your editing choices and your style and everything sort of plays into hand. But I think well, one of the things, just to kind of circulate on that, is that one of the things that I sort of said to Roy is that, when you come across documentaries like this, you don't often find space to laugh or space to sort of just feel a bit of the lightness of it all. And I think, yeah, this wasn't an attempt to excuse, but definitely say, well, what is the line of thread that you experienced?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's, I thoroughly enjoy the film, and I wonder what ordinary Zimbabweans would think. I mean, you started off by, saying that they were very critical of the narratives of the West that was coming out to the West about Zimbabwe. And I wonder what would be the perspective of ordinary Zimbabwe. I mean, if this film was shown in Zimbabwe, and I'm sure there's some Zimbabweans in the audience, so you know what I'm going to do next. But if this film was shown in Zimbabwe, what do you think the reaction would be?
I've shown the film about Mugabe in Zimbabwe with Neville back in 2012, and the reaction was kind of like, they're more like, wow, because Bob Mugabe doesn't allow
Mm,
that people to get that access. And so, what would the reaction be? No, actually, I don't know. It's a good
mm,
question. Maybe you actually, yeah, throw it out to the
yeah.
Zimbabweans. But I have to say, in fact, I was talking to Tendai Biti,
Mhm,
who's a member of the opposition, and he said the issue that they have is that Zimbabweans are not writing their history, and a lot of that is to do with the trauma
mhm,
that many people had been through um, during the war, and 80s and beyond. And so Mugabe died without writing his memoirs. I spoke to his wife
mm,
Grace not too long ago, and he tried to write his memoirs, and they put writers in front of him, but they're all too young and couldn't understand. He couldn't really relay his history to them.
mhm,
But I think that's a bit a failure on his part, especially being a former school teacher, that a man of his
mm.
stature died without writing his memoirs. Um, but I think that's as Tendai Biti said, that's a thing that more people are trying to do.
Yeah.
They come closer together, but there's still segregation because, we're talking, what was it, 15 million black Zimbabweans. And at the time I was there, maybe 40 or 50,000 white Zimbabweans. And so, yeah, there was that segregation. But
Who owned what percentage of the land? The white Zimbabweans
yeah,
owned a very significant percentage of the land.
surely when it comes to
Mm.
farmland, but I
Mm.
think, well, you're talking about the communities. Yeah. No, there was that segregation. They kept to themselves, but there's still harmony, absolute harmony, between the black and white Zimbabweans. But there was that segregation. You try and encapsulate Zimbabwe, and Zimbabweans
Cool.
and Mugabe, very funny people, very humorous, very similar to Ghanaians. And that's what I wanted to kind of bring out in this. And you saw the way Mugabe presents himself, even when he was dealing with the director in that campaign, or even the way he had to wriggle out of that situation when he was presented with a tricky scenario. These are really intelligent people that came to him and said, "We've got no money. We haven't even got fuel." And how he wriggled out and threw it onto his minister, and that's him. I lived in Harare, and most of my friends they were MDC, and they obviously opposed ZANU-PF, but they always had that respect for him because of the education.
Mm.
He's very educated, and he educated the nation. But he also was a very funny guy, and he also represented Zimbabweans on the world stage very well. So although though many people despised him, even those that did despise him still had that respect for him. So to the style, again, I'm a former kids presenter, and so I wanted to bring myself to it, and he was also game.
Mm. It's very British humor.
Mm, mm,
Mm.
yes.
Not saying there's anything wrong with that.
With regards to how the land reform happened, it was very emotive, and it was done in a real haphazard way. But what people have this misconception that because the land was transferred from the white farmers to the blacks, and then everything failed. That's not actually true. Many small scale farmers actually succeeded in farming tobacco, maize, barley. Um, yes, there was a great deal of land went to the cronies, but not all cronies are the same. And so some of the cronies that I've visited their farms, they were very, very productive. And so, yes, there was a lack of planning. People had farms just to say, I've got a farm. Many people were mobile phone farmers, will be in the city and say, hey, you must be, sort out that irrigation there. And it never worked that way. But, I think he's more of an ideologist, word I can never say. But he, I wouldn't say people talk about Mugabe, was he a business orientated person? I didn't see that. Yeah. To your question about what's the journey next, me and Andy always talk about this, along with Neville, about documenting more of our history, but using different ways and methods to draw young people in. So we always talk about avatars and VAR and bringing back Mandela or Gaddafi and putting them around the table and see how we can tell stories in a different way. And so we're looking at different ways to tell those stories, but yeah, and also trying to make our way back home.
Mhm.
I was there in February this year. Uh, the President Edi Mnangagwa, who I actually know quite well, and it's funny with ED is that when I first went to Zimbabwe, building up the credits to get to people, he was the first minister that I interviewed. So he gave me, a car and fuel and access to hotel, and I interviewed him for like 2 or 3 hours. So when I then said to people, I've interviewed ED, then I was able to speak to many different ministers. So in terms of as a human, I got along really well with ED. I don't know. I haven't kept abreast in terms of what's the climate's like in Zimbabwe at the moment. When I traveled there, I saw the airport looked fantastic. There's a lot more roads that are being built. There are always challenges. Zimbabwe's favorite word, by the way, challenges. There's always challenges in Zim, but I guess there's other Zimbabweans, I'm sure, that can talk to the current situation. It's always difficult when you're not there. When you're not, that's what I found. You got to be there and be there for some time to say, okay, here's my personal view on Zimbabwe rather than what I've read and what somebody's told me. And to your second question,
Can I just add to that first one? Because I think what I was also hearing there was about sort of portrayal and how stories are told and fed to audiences in the West. And when you look at the way in which portrayals of any country that isn't in control of their representation, we are seeing the live streaming of, the complete obliteration of people, because you don't have, storytellers, you don't have journalists, you don't have media organizations that are prepared to say, well, where is the truth in all of this and where do we stand? And so I think that, this is, there has to be some form of a resistance when you are telling any kind of story that just wants to redress what is taken for given and what is taken for as sort of a factual account. There should be many more people sort of propelled to sort of saying certain things. And I think that it's somewhere in your question I was hearing that, beyond just Zimbabwe, it's also like Zimbabwe isn't topical at the moment, but there are other countries that are topical. There are other stories that are topical, and we are seeing the complete denial of filmmaking ability or storytelling ability, be it journalists or reporters, just to report on what's happening. We talked about one of the scenes that was in the film here, about do you keep certain things in or don't you? And I'd say to Roy, well, actually, that's what you filmed. That's just what happened in front of you. For instance, that scene of the young filmmaker making having that moment, or when he's making the address to the cabinet. That's what happened. There were other moments that happened, and obviously we put that together, but it's it is really sometimes just that they say that documentaries in particular are just the representation of what actually happened, and that we're seeing a great denial of that from many different sources, and you can actually boil that down to maybe 6 media empires. So there's a great battle to be had.
Mhm.
Thank you for that. So we're currently in conversation with the BBC. Actually, we're in an entanglement with them. So so we hope in the new year that you'll be able to see it on the iPlayer or their world service. But yeah, that's TBC. A film like this isn't easy.